Dawn made the desert hold its breath. 12 riders ringed the cottonwoods. A bought marshal spat, "Trespasser," and Caleb Dust Mercer lowered his rifle just enough to say, "Come and take it." An arrow hissed from the grass, a saddle went empty, and the spring kept whispering like a witness that would not lie. The day before that standoff, Silver Butte had baked under a noon sun so fierce it seemed to bleach the color out of the air. Dust's boots scraped the boards of the main street, his frame thin from too many meals skipped, his throat so dry he could have sworn the heat had stolen the words from it. A heavy, worn coin purse hung at his hip. When he weighed it in his hand, it gave off a pitiful clink. $3.47. Enough for a drink, maybe two. Not nearly enough for a bed. The saloon's bat-wing doors yawned like a pair of tired arms, and Dust let them swing closed behind him. The air inside was thick with old whiskey, and the tang of sweat soaked deep into the floorboards. He moved slow to the bar, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. "Hot one," he rasped, sliding a few coins toward the barkeep. A few stools down, a big-bellied man in a sweat-darkened hat was talking louder than the piano in the corner. Jed Crane, rancher, occasional drunk, was halfway through a bottle and telling anyone who'd listen that his land was cursed. "Bad water," Jed slurred, jabbing a finger toward no one in particular. "Livestock won't touch it. Nights you can hear things crying." He took another swallow, then leaned in toward Dust as if they were old friends. $10, he said, "and you can have it, all of it." Dust chuckled without humor. "Land for $10? What's the catch?" Jed shrugged. "Taxes due, fence fallen, place ain't fit for man nor beast." Dust's gaze drifted to the door, out toward where his mare waited in the sun. She'd been a good horse once, worth more than he'd ever paid for her, but now she swayed on her feet, ribs showing through her coat. He thought of the empty road behind him, the years he'd spent riding nowhere in particular, and the ghosts he carried with him. The idea struck quick, the way bad ones often do. "I'll trade you the mare," he said, "and the bridle. You keep 5 for your trouble." Jed's grin showed the gap where a tooth had been. The deal was struck fast. Mare, bridle, a few coins to cover the ledger. A quitclaim deed was scrawled out on a torn sheet and stamped with the tattered store seal. Dust left the saloon on foot, a folded paper in his pocket and a sour taste in his mouth. 5 miles of dirt road carried him away from town. The desert around Silver Butte wasn't barren. Sage and mesquite clung to the dry ground, but it had a way of reminding a man how small he was. By the time the fences came into view, the sun was dipping low. The posts leaned like tired sentries. Wire rusted through in places. The barn roof sagged in the middle, and the house, maybe white once, was gray and peeling, its windows clouded with dust. Something else caught his attention, a trail of footprints in the dirt, sharp-edged and fresh. Near the barn, a scatter of ashes still clung to the smell of burned cedar. Dust felt the weight of his colt at his side. The barn door hung half open, creaking in the wind. He pushed it wider, letting the gloom swallow him. That's when he saw her. A woman stood in the far corner, bow drawn, the arrowhead leveled at his chest. Her eyes were dark and steady, her cheek marked with fine-lined scars and a pattern he didn't know. Long black hair, braided and threaded with beads, caught the dying light through the slats. "You can't stay here," she said. Her voice was precise, her English accented, but her tone left no room for argument. "This is my home." They stared at each other across the dust and shadows. Dust caught the scent of wood smoke and something green, sage, maybe, clinging to her clothes. She was lean in the way people get when food is scarce but work is plenty. His gaze flicked to a small shelf behind her, where a book lay half covered in dust. Its pages were swollen from water damage, the leather warped.
For reasons he couldn't name, he stepped toward it, reading aloud the faint words on the open page. "The Lord is my shepherd." The words felt strange on his tongue, but they steadied something in him. Her bow didn't lower, but her eyes shifted, just slightly. He stopped where he was, the fading light painting long bars across the dirt floor, and thought, "Well, this is going to be interesting." For a long moment, neither of them moved.
Dust's shoulder ached where an old cattle drive bullet had healed wrong, tightening whenever trouble was close. The woman's grip on the bow was steady as stone. "What's your name?" he asked. "Taya Nez." She said it like it was all the answer he deserved. "Caleb Mercer. Folks call me Dust." Her gaze flicked to the folded paper in his hand. "That says nothing to me. This land belonged to my family before your paper existed." He almost smiled, though there was nothing funny in it. "I've got taxes due and a quitclaim deed that says otherwise." That drew a sound from her, a bitter laugh with no mirth. "Quitclaim," she repeated. "Did you get it from a man named Pike?" "No," Dust said, "from a drunk named Jed Crane." Her expression darkened. Crane worked for Pike. They all do. She didn't explain who Pike was, not yet. Instead, she lowered the bow just enough to speak without tension in the string. "You want to see why this land matters? Follow me." They stepped out of the barn, the light slipping into the long gold of late afternoon. She led him through grass that brushed their knees, past the ghost of an old garden where fence posts leaned like grave markers. The air grew cooler, carrying a scent Dust hadn't smelled in years, clean water. They came to a stand of ancient cottonwoods, their roots knuckled deep into the earth. In the center lay a pool no bigger than a horse trough, its surface so clear it mirrored the first stars. Water bubbled up from beneath, making the reflection ripple. "This spring has never gone dry," Taya said. "Not in the worst summers, not when rivers turn to dust." Her voice softened, as if speaking to someone not present. "My grandmother's grandmother was born beside it. We guarded it for generations." Dust knelt, cupping the water in his hands. It was cold enough to make his teeth ache, sweet in a way he could taste down to his chest. "That why you stayed when your people moved?" Her shoulders stiffened. "They did not ask me to move. They sent me away." He didn't press, but the silence stretched between them until she broke it herself. "3 winters ago, my people took a white man prisoner. He was a thief, but I thought mercy was always right. I freed him." Her jaw tightened. 3 days later, he came back with soldiers. They burned our lodges, killed my cousin, her baby, my grandfather. "Because of me." The ritual scars on her cheek caught the last red light of day. "They marked me so all would know the one who betrayed her people." She looked back at the spring. "I cannot go home. I cannot go forward. So I guard this place." Dust shifted his weight, the guilt in her words striking something familiar in his own. He thought of his younger brother's pale face, of the coins that had never been enough for medicine, and the cold truth that sometimes trying isn't the same as saving. "What does Pike want with it?" Dust asked. "Silver," she said simply. "His mines drink water like a man dying in the desert. This spring could feed his stamp mill for decades." "Stamp mill?" She nodded. "They crush rock to dust for silver. Without water, it stops. The other sources near his claims are drying." Dust took another drink from the pool, watching the ripples erase his reflection. "So what happens if Pike gets it?" Taya's voice was as flat as the horizon. "Then the water will be gone. The cottonwoods will die. And my people's last sacred place will be gone with them." They walked back to the house in silence. The 2-room building leaned just enough to let wind sing through the gaps. Dust glanced toward the barn. "You take the barn, I'll take the front room." Her brows rose.
"You think we can live here without killing each other?" "Long as we don't get in each other's way," he said. "You keep your spring, I'll keep my roof from falling in." That night, the wind picked up, rattling loose boards. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote called. Dust lay on a lumpy mattress, staring at the hole in the ceiling. In the barn, Taya sat with her back against the wall, bow across her lap. The dog, when had he picked up a dog, curled at the door, one milky eye half open, the other tracking every sound. Neither slept much. When Dust rose to pour a cup of water from the bucket, he caught sight of Taya moving outside, a dark shape against the paler dark of the cottonwoods. She paused at the spring, touching the surface as if to reassure herself it was still there. He stood in the doorway, not calling out. The night air carried the faint, steady murmur of the water, like a clock that kept its own time, patient and unstoppable. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The first 3 weeks passed in a rhythm so simple it almost felt foreign to Dust. Mornings, he split cedar logs until the muscles in his forearms knotted tight. The smell of resin clung to his shirt, sweet and sharp in the cool hours before the sun climbed high. At midday, they patched leaks in the roof, crouched side by side on the warped shingles while the wind tried to lift them away. By afternoon, Dust walked the property line, stretching new wire over leaning fence posts, his boots stirring the smell of sun-baked earth. In the quiet between chores, lessons passed both ways. Taya taught him to spot edible greens among the tumbleweed, to read the scratch of claws on a fence post and know whether it belonged to a bobcat or a rabbit. In return, Dust showed her 3 simple chords on the guitar, the kind that could carry any tune if you played them with the right touch. She practiced until her fingers bore the faint ridges of the strings. The spring ran clear and steady, its voice constant even in the heat that scorched the hills. Don Mateo had stopped by one afternoon, a coil of fencing wire over his shoulder. He squatted by the water, cupping his hands and drinking deep before speaking. "A small vein like this," he said, "is more precious than a wide creek in the wet season. When the dry comes, this one will still be here." He glanced up at Dust. "Water keeps people. Whiskey drives them away." The words settled between them, heavier than they first seemed. Dust didn't speak of the folded county notice tucked inside his coat. The tax on the land was due in less than 2 weeks. If Pike knew it, and Dust figured he did, he'd be back with more than an offer. Evening light stretched the shadows long over the yard. Dust paused at the corner of the fence, his hand resting on a new post. That's when he noticed it. A length of wire had been loosened, the twist bent back as if someone had tested the strength of the boundary. In the dirt nearby, a hoofprint lay fresh enough that the wind hadn't yet blurred its edges. He said nothing to Taya over supper. The meal was simple, beans and cornbread, but he ladled her a larger portion without comment. She didn't mention it either, though she caught the gesture and looked at him for a moment before returning to her plate. Mercy lay under the table, one ear flicking at every shift of the wind. That night, the desert seemed quieter than usual. No coyote calls, no owl, just the low rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods and the steady pulse of the spring. Dust sat on the porch for a while, rolling a toothpick between his fingers, eyes on the horizon where the last glow of daylight faded to black. Somewhere past the cottonwoods, a rider watched without moving. The fire had been small, just a lick of flame along the side of the shed where they stored tools, but it left a black smear against the boards like a warning written in soot. Dust found it at dawn, still warm to the touch. He poured a bucket from the spring over it, watching the steam rise and curl away. By mid-morning, a wagon creaked into the yard, pulled by a sway-back mare the color of old snow. Martha Ellsworth sat tall on the seat, a broad-brimmed hat shadowing her eyes. She was a widow with a spine straighter than any fence post Dust had set, and the smell of bread seemed to follow her wherever she went. "I heard about your trouble," she said, stepping down and lifting a covered basket from the wagon bed. "Figured you could use something warm." Inside the basket lay a round loaf, still steaming, and 3 sheets of corrugated tin. "The tin's from my own shed roof. I reckon your barn needs it more than I do." Dust took the weight of the metal, surprised at the offer. "You didn't have to." "I did," she cut in, her voice firm but kind. She glanced at the scorched wall. "Bad men like to start small. Test your defenses before they come for the real prize." Taya emerged from the barn, bow in hand but lowered. She studied Martha with the wary eyes she reserved for strangers. The older woman stepped closer, holding out the loaf. "Blessed are the peacemakers," Martha said softly, "for they shall be called the children of God." She met Taya's gaze without flinching. Peace doesn't always mean laying down your bow. Sometimes it means building bridges before the war burns them all. Taya hesitated, then took the bread. Her fingers brushed Martha's, and some of the tension in her shoulders eased. They spent the next hour on the roof, dust hammering, while Martha measured and handed up pieces of tin. She moved like someone who'd built more than one home in her time, sure-footed even on the warped planks. When they were done, the barn looked no less old, but at least the sky wouldn't leak through. Dust wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Thank you," he said, meaning more than just the tin. Martha waved him off. "Don't thank me yet. If Pike's the one sending fires your way, you'll need more than patched roofs." Taya leaned against the barn door, the loaf cradled in the crook of her arm. She still didn't speak much, but she nodded, an acknowledgement that this, at least, was a kind of trust. Before leaving, Martha turned back at the wagon. "You keep your spring, you keep your roof, but more than that, keep your neighbors close. Trouble rides faster than help." Dust watched her go until the wagon disappeared into the shimmer of heat on the road. He knew she was right. The first fire wouldn't be the last. That evening, they ate the bread with the last of the beans, the crust crisp and the inside soft enough to make Dust remember his mother's kitchen. He caught Taya watching him across the table, her expression unreadable but calmer than he'd seen it in days. The spring murmured beyond the cottonwoods, a steady reminder that some things endured if you fought hard enough to keep 'em. 2 days after Martha's visit, the wind shifted from the south, carrying with it the faint scent of ink and newsprint, at least to Dust's mind. Ada Penrose arrived just before noon, riding a wiry roan mare and wearing a jacket patched at the elbows, but clean. She was the editor of the Silver Butte Chronicle, a paper so thin it often doubled as kindling, yet her pen carried more weight than some rifles in the territory. She dismounted with the ease of someone used to dusty roads, her saddlebags heavy with folded papers. "Heard Pike came sniffing around," she said without preamble. "Figured you should know what kind of animal you're dealing with." At the table, she laid out a thin stack of clippings and handwritten notes. Some were yellowed with age, others fresh from her press. Each told a piece of a larger, uglier story. Ranchers forced off their land, miners cheated out of claims, water rights signed away under pressure or threat. "Patterns clear," Ada said, tapping a page with her ink-stained finger. "Pike offers a price low enough to insult a drunk, then sends trouble when they refuse. By the time he comes back, they're either desperate enough to sell cheap or gone altogether." Taya hovered nearby, listening without speaking, her eyes narrowing at the names Ada read aloud. One of them made her shoulders stiffen. Dust caught it. "You know him?" he asked. "He commanded the soldiers who came from my family," she said quietly. "Pike paid him." Ada looked from one to the other. "Then this isn't just about the spring. This is about finishing something he started." She slid a fresh sheet of paper across the table. "You've got a quitclaim deed, handwritten by Jed Crane and witnessed by who?" Dust hesitated. "No one, just his mark, mine, and a store clerk's seal." "Then you need better paper," Ada said. "Real paper. I can draft a formal deed and file it with the county. Won't stop a bullet, but it'll give you something to wave in a marshal's face that isn't just calligraphy on scrap." Dust leaned back, studying her. "And why help us?" Ada smiled thinly. "Because men like Pike think they can write the history of this territory in their own hand. I prefer to hold the pen myself." Before she left, she handed Dust a smaller folded note. "If trouble comes before the deed's filed, send Mercy with this to town. I'll write it up in the Chronicle and send a copy to the circuit judge. Judges travel slow, but ink has a way of sticking in the public's craw." After Ada rode away, the yard felt quieter, but not safer. Dust tucked the note into the same inside pocket as the tax notice. 2 pieces of paper, one that could give him ground to stand on, and one that could see him lose it all. That night, by the spring, he caught Taya humming under her breath, the melody unfamiliar but steady as the water's flow. She stopped when she realized he was listening. "What's it mean?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "It's a song about memory," she said, "how the earth remembers what's been taken from it." Dust figured the spring remembered plenty, and soon so would the county clerk's records. The heat had settled over the ranch like a thick blanket when Dust heard the rhythmic creak of leather and the clink of spurs.
3 riders came into view through the wavering mirage of midday, 2 with their hats low and hands near their gun belts, and the one in the middle dressed like a man who thought dust was something that happened to other people. Silas Pike sat tall on a black geldon that looked more muscle than bone. His suit was dark and pressed, his boots polished to a shine that didn't belong on ranch dirt. Even his smile looked pressed, creased at the edges, stiff as starch. "You must be the new fool on Crane's cursed patch," Pike called as they closed the distance. Dust straightened from the half-mended gatepost he'd been working on, resting one hand casually on the top rail. "Name's Caleb Mercer," he said evenly. "Don't recall inviting company." Pike's eyes scanned the property, lingering on the barn, the cottonwoods, the faint glint of the spring beyond. "I'm here to save you time and heartache. $500 for this worthless patch of dirt." 50 times what I paid, Dust said. "That's generous." "It's practical," Pike replied. "You can take the money and start over somewhere else. Or you can stay here and find out why they call it cursed." Dust set down his hammer and met Pike's gaze without blinking. "I've been cursed before. Lived through it." One of Pike's riders shifted in the saddle, the leather squeaking. The other scanned the tree line with the slow, deliberate eye of a man mapping out angles for gunfire. "Consider it friendly advice," Pike said, his voice dropping just enough to sharpen its edge. "This territory has a way of resolving disputes. Permanently." Dust shrugged and picked up the hammer again. "I just got here, haven't had time to decide if it's worthless yet." For the briefest moment, Pike's smile thinned to nothing. "Think fast," he said, tugging the reins. "Opportunities expire." As they turned their horses, Dust caught a flicker of movement in the tall grass beyond the barn. Taya, crouched low, bow drawn, eyes tracking the riders. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. When Pike was far enough down the trail, Taya emerged like a shadow pulled into the sun. "Why not shoot?" Dust asked. "Because arrows don't stop the kind of man who sends others to bleed for him," she said. Dust couldn't argue with that.
That night, he wrote Pike's name on a scrap of paper and weighed it down with a pebble on the kitchen table. A reminder, the kind of man you don't ignore, because the moment you turn your back, he's already moving pieces you can't see. The smell hit Dust before the sound, burnt mesquite, sharp and oily in the cool of night. He was halfway out of bed before he realized the glow flickering against the wall wasn't moonlight. The barn was burning. Barefoot, he grabbed the nearest bucket and bolted into the yard. Flames licked the old timber like they'd been waiting years for permission, climbing fast toward the roof. Sparks whirled into the night air, carried by a dry breeze that seemed to favor the fire's cause. "Taya!" he shouted. She was already there, bow in hand, her dark braid swinging as she loosed an arrow into the shadows beyond the fence. A man cursed and went crashing through the sagebrush, leaving behind the hiss of another arrow finding its mark. "Water!" she called. They fell into an unspoken rhythm, passing buckets from the spring like soldiers on a line. The fire hissed and spat as cold water met heat, steam wrapping around them in ghostly plumes. Mercy barked from the porch, low and furious, pacing between the house and the blaze as if daring the night to throw more at them. Dust's arms burned from the weight of the buckets, his lungs raw with smoke. But he kept going, meeting Taya's eyes in the shifting light each time their hands brushed over the rope handles. The fire fought to hold on. The barn roof sagged, timbers groaning under the heat, before finally giving way with a crash that sent embers spiraling into the sky. For a moment, it looked like the whole structure would collapse in on itself. But the flames began to lose their hunger, beaten back by steady, relentless work. When it was done, the barn still stood, blackened, scarred, but standing. The night air was heavy with the smell of wet ash. They sat on the porch steps, silent but breathing in sync. Smoke had painted Taya's cheeks with streaks of soot, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the dark beyond the yard. "He's testing us," she said finally. Dust nodded. "And next time, he won't send amateurs." The first light of dawn brought Mercer, riding in with her apron still on and a wagon piled with scrap tin and wooden planks. "Saw the glow from town," she said, climbing down without waiting for thanks. "You'll need these to patch what's left." Not long after, Don Mateo arrived with a coil of barbed wire and a sack of nails slung over one shoulder. "For your fence," he said simply, setting it down beside the steps. "A fire draws coyotes, four-legged and otherwise." By mid-morning, Ada appeared, notebook in hand, eyes taking in every charred beam and scorched post. She crouched near the barn door, running her fingers over the fresh burns. "This will read well in print," she murmured. "Attempted arson, malicious destruction of property. Combined with Pike's visit, it paints a picture a judge might take interest in." Dust almost smiled. Paper, nails, and tin, it wasn't exactly an army, but it was something. And as he stood by the spring that night, letting the cold water run over his smoke-stung hands, he realized something else. Pike had sent fire to break them. All it had done was burn away any doubt about staying. The night after the fire, the ranch felt different, like the land itself was holding its breath. The scorched barn stood as a reminder in the moonlight, but the spring still whispered its steady hymn. Dust sat on an overturned crate by the water, his battered guitar resting on his knee. He plucked out the 3 chords he still remembered, slow, deliberate, letting the sound carry into the stillness. No words, just the low hum of strings. Taya came barefoot through the grass, her steps soundless. She sat on the opposite side of the spring and began to hum along, her voice moving into a melody older than the boards of the house, older than the fences, older than the town itself. It wasn't a song he recognized. The language rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, each note seeming to weave itself into the sound of the water. Dust played softer, letting her voice take the lead. When the song ended, there was a pause that felt sacred. The only sound was the ripple of water over stone. "You'll be like a well-watered garden," a voice said quietly behind them. They turned to see Martha standing in the moonlight, a tin cup of water in her hands. She stepped closer, her eyes on Taya. "Isaiah," she explained, 58:11. "A promise for those who care for what's been entrusted to them." Taya lowered her gaze, as if weighing the words. "A garden takes more than water," she said. "It needs someone willing to fight for it." Martha nodded. "And you have that. 2 someones by the look of it. She set the cup down by the spring and left without waiting for thanks, her footsteps fading into the night. Dust strummed a soft chord. "She's right, you know. You've been fighting for this place longer than I have." "And you?" Taya asked. "I've been running," he admitted, "until I got here." She studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then she glanced toward the cottonwoods, their leaves glinting silver under the moon. "Tomorrow," she said, "I go to my people." "Even with the banishment?" Her jaw tightened. "I go for the spring. If they will not come for me, perhaps they will come for the water. It is harder to refuse the ancestors than the living." Dust set the guitar aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not going alone." She shook her head. "If you follow, they will not listen. They must see me walk back on my own feet. They must believe it is my will, not another's." The spring gurgled between them, filling the silence. "Then I'll be here when you return," Dust said finally. "And if I don't? Then I'll figure out how to hold this place myself, with whatever I have left." Her lips curved, just barely. Stubborn man. They sat until the moon slid behind the hills, the night carrying their unspoken thoughts like the spring carried its water, quiet, steady, and without end. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first light of day spilled over Silver Butte, turning the cottonwoods into a row of silent sentries. Dust was on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold when he saw the riders. 12 of them, dark shapes against the pale horizon, moving in a slow, deliberate line. At their head was Marshal Otis Rudd, the tin star on his chest catching the sun like a shard of ice. He reined up at the edge of the yard, a folded document in one hand. Behind him, Silas Pike sat high in the saddle, a smirk cutting across his face.
"Caleb McGraw," Rudd called, reading from the page, "by order of the county court, you are hereby commanded to vacate these premises, house, land, and water rights effective immediately. You will surrender possession to Silas Pike, lawful claimant." Dust rose slowly, setting his cup on the porch rail. His right hand brushed the butt of his Colt, not to draw, but to steady the faint tremor still lingering from a sleepless night. "This your idea of lawful?" he asked. Rudd's mouth tightened. 10 minutes. After that, we remove you by force." The horses shifted restlessly. Dust could hear the creak of leather, the faint metallic chime of stirrups. Somewhere behind Pike's line, a crow called once and fell silent. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching on the dry earth, and stopped in the center of the yard. "Come and take it," he said. A murmur passed through Pike's men. Rudd's jaw worked, but he didn't answer right away. Dust let the silence stretch, the morning air thick with the weight of the choice they'd all just made. On the rise beyond the yard, Ada Penrose sat side-saddle on a bay mare, notebook balanced on her knee. Even at this distance, Dust knew she was counting heads, noting rifles, watching the way Pike leaned forward in his saddle like a man smelling victory too soon. 9 minutes. The spring gurgled softly somewhere behind him, steady and unbothered. Dust found that sound and held it in his mind, letting it anchor him against the itch to reach for his gun. Rudd glanced back at Pike, then at the paper in his hand. 8 minutes, he said, his voice harder now. Dust didn't move. The breeze lifted the edges of his coat, carried the faint scent of cottonwood sap. Somewhere far off, a hawk screamed. The day had begun, and there would be no turning it back. 7 minutes. The line of Pike's riders held its shape, horses stamping, the morning sun glinting on rifle barrels. Dust kept his eyes on Rudd, but he saw Pike lean to murmur something to the man beside him. It was the kind of movement you saw just before someone decided to end a conversation with lead. That's when it came, the hiss of something cutting air.
A shaft of cedar blurred past Dust's shoulder and buried itself in the dust between Rudd's horse and Pike's. The marshal's mount danced sideways, smarting hard.
A second arrow followed, thudding into the ground at a sharper angle. This one was wrapped with a strip of red cloth. No mistake, no warning gone astray. Pike wheeled in his saddle, scanning the ridge behind them. From the tall buffalo grass emerged shapes, 10 of them, painted and silent, moving like the land itself had decided to rise. The warriors came in from the blind side, their line fanning out with practiced precision. No yells, no wild rush, just the measured advance of men who knew they didn't have to shout to be heard. Dust didn't move. He didn't have to. Pike's formation faltered. 2 riders edged their mounts away from the arrow's landing point. Rudd turned halfway, his face tightening as he saw the second front closing in. From the center of that line, Taya stepped forward. She wore the paint of her people, not as decoration, but as statement. Across her shoulders was a bow, the string taut. She stopped between Dust and the warriors, her stance angled toward Pike's men. Her eyes found Dust for a heartbeat, steady, unflinching, then returned to the threat in front of her.
The warriors halted just out of rifle range, each man holding his position like a piece in a game Pike didn't know how to play. Silas Pike spat in the dirt. "This your doing, McGraw?" Dust kept his voice level. "This is the land's doing." Somewhere up the line, a nervous horse sidestepped, jangling its bit. On the ridge beyond, the red cloth on that arrow fluttered once in the breeze, a quiet banner in the morning light. The circle around Pike was no longer just 12 riders. It was closing, and it wasn't closing around the spring. It was closing around him. 6 minutes, maybe less. Pike's eyes kept darting between the warriors and Dust, weighing which threat would move first. The tension stretched tight enough to hum. One of Pike's men, a thin rider with a twitch in his jaw, nudged his horse forward a half step. That was enough. Pike snapped something under his breath and dug his heels into his gelding. The horse lunged toward the porch. Dust stepped aside, letting Pike blow past him, then pivoted hard, grabbing the back of Pike's coat and yanking. The rancher came off his saddle in a heap, boots kicking up dry earth.
The 2 hit the ground, rolling once before Dust planted a knee between Pike's shoulders. The man bucked under him, twisting to land a wild punch that caught Dust high on the cheekbone. Stars burst in his vision, but his grip held. Somewhere behind them, a horse screamed. Mercy's bark cut sharp through the noise, followed by a yelp from a man, one of Pike's gun hands, who tried to rush the yard. The dog stood between him and the porch, teeth bared, tail rigid. Dust wrenched Pike's arm just enough to make him stop struggling. He could feel the man's breath, hot and ragged, smell the sour mix of whiskey and dust. He thought of the nights Pike had sent men to burn his barn, of the morning they'd found Taya's bow broken in the yard, of the years this man had taken from others without a second thought. It would be so easy. A twist more, and Pike would be out of the fight for good. Then another image came. Ada's pen moving across the page. The quiet way Taya had set her bow aside when the warriors halted. The spring's voice behind the cottonwoods, patient and steady. Dust eased his grip. "Get up," he said, his voice flat.
Pike rolled to his knees, glaring up like a man cheated of something he thought he deserved. On the edge of the yard, the tribal chief, Taya's father, rode forward. His face was calm, the kind of calm that men listen. "We came to protect the water," he said, his gaze moving between Dust and Pike, "not to spill more into the ground." Dust rose, brushing dust from his hands, and stepped back. The choice had been made. Pike was still breathing, but so was the spring. The yard had gone still, except for the low huff of horses. Pike stood with dust on his suit and rage burning in his eyes, but he said nothing. Not yet. Martha stepped forward from the porch, apron still on, hands planted on her hips like a schoolteacher calling boys to order. Ada was beside her, notebook open, pencil poised. "Silas Pike," Ada said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. "In the presence of witnesses, you will sign this quitclaim deed, surrendering all claims to the McGraw property, water rights included. Failure to do so will be noted and sworn in testimony before Judge Harlan on his next circuit." Pike let out a sharp laugh. "You think a paper will stop me?" "No," Dust said.
"But it will slow you down." He nodded toward Marshal Rudd, who sat stone-faced on his horse. "And the marshal here can hand over his badge now. You acted outside the law, Otis, and you know it." For a moment, Rudd didn't move. Then, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long, he unclipped the tin star from his vest and tossed it into the dirt. "Guess I'll walk to town," he muttered. Two of the warriors stepped forward, flanking Pike without touching him. The message was clear: sign, or this would drag out longer than he could stand. Martha brought out the small folding table from her kitchen, slamming it down in the dust. Ada placed the document on top, weighting the corners with her inkwell. Pike stared at it, then at Dust. "You think you've won?" Dust's voice was steady, almost quiet. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Pike's lip curled, but his hand moved. The pen scratched across the paper, his name etched in a hard, angry scrawl. Ada took the deed, checked the signature, and slid it into her satchel like a loaded pistol. "Filed, witnessed, and sealed by public record," she said. "It's yours, Caleb." Dust didn't answer. He just watched Pike mount his gelding, the man's pride riding out before him like a shadow. The spring gurgled behind the cottonwoods, and for the first time in days, Dust felt the weight in his chest begin to ease. The dust from Pike's departure hadn't yet settled when the chief dismounted. He stood tall, the paint on his face tracing the lines of a man who had seen too many battles. Some fought with weapons, others with pride. Taya approached slowly, the war paint still streaked across her cheeks. Her bow was unstrung, but her shoulders were square, her eyes locked on her father's. For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them was heavy with years. Years since the raid, the exile, and the word traitor whispered like a curse in campfires she was no longer welcome to sit beside. The chief's gaze softened first. "You returned for water?" he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd rehearsed other words and found them too small. "Not for me." "I returned for both," she replied. "You just didn't know it." He let that sit, as if testing the truth of it against his own memory. Then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. "What was once called betrayal," he said, "may be remembered as mercy. You spared a life when others would not. That is not a sin. It is strength." A breath she didn't realize she was holding escaped her chest. She glanced toward Dust, who stood a few steps back, hat in hand. He gave her the smallest of nods, and for the first time in years she didn't feel the need to explain herself. The chief looked at him next. "You fought beside her without taking what was not yours. That is uncommon." Dust shrugged lightly. "Wasn't mine to take." From the edge of the yard, a voice broke in. Pike's, calling back over his shoulder as he rode away. "Don't plant your flag too deep, McGraw. There's law bigger than this county, and it's comin'." Dust didn't answer. The threat felt thin now, like a shadow stretched too far to be sharp. The chief turned back to his warriors, giving a quiet order. They began to melt back into the grass and ridges, their departure as silent as their arrival. Taya stood beside her father for a moment longer, their shadows touching in the late morning sun. For the first time since she was a girl, she didn't feel like she was standing on opposite ground. By the time Pike's riders crested the far ridge, the yard was quiet except for the shifting of horse hooves and the creak of leather. The warriors had already begun their withdrawal, vanishing one by one into the tall grass until only the chief remained, watching Pike's dust trail fade into the pale distance. Ada stepped forward, a neat stack of papers in her hand. 2 signatures, 4 sworn witness statements, and a full record of the marshal's badge being surrendered, she said. This is more than enough for Judge Harlan and the territorial attorney if Pike decides to push his luck. She glanced at the ridge. He'll try. Men like him can't stand still. But now he's got to wade through the law before he gets anywhere near here again. Dust took the papers, tucking them into the inside pocket of his coat. They felt heavier than paper ought to, as if the ink itself carried weight. Martha was already moving, collecting the folding table, brushing dust from the tabletop like this had all been some long morning chore. "I'll get these filed with the postwriter tomorrow," she said, her voice brisk, but her eyes lingering on Dust and Taya.
"You two take the rest of the day to remember what quiet sounds like." The chief turned his gaze to his daughter. "The spring is still yours to guard," he said. "We will watch the hills, but the tending, that is your work." Taya inclined her head, the faintest curve of a smile on her lips. "It always has been." With that, he mounted and rode off, his silhouette shrinking against the bright sweep of the land until it was gone. Ada closed her notebook, giving Dust a small nod. "I'll send my article by wire once it's printed. The whole county should know the kind of law Pike keeps in his pockets." Dust gave her a faint grin. "Just make sure they spell my name right." She laughed once, low and dry, before swinging into her saddle and following the others out. When the last hoofbeat faded, the ranch felt different. Not safer, not yet, but steadier, like a man who's been leaning against the wind and finally stands upright. The spring murmured under the cottonwoods. Dust looked at it, then at Taya, and for the first time in days, neither of them felt watched. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0.
The yard lay quiet except for the faint hiss of water in the cottonwoods. The last of Pike's riders had vanished over the ridge, their dust drifting like smoke from a snuffed lamp. Chief Nez stood in the open, hat in hand, his voice slow and deliberate in English. "You kept the water," he said, "and my daughter. Brother." The word landed heavier than a badge, heavier than the rifle Dust still carried at his side. He nodded once, unable to answer right away, the cottonwood shadows falling long between them. In front of Martha and Ada, the chief turned to Taya. "What was called betrayal," he said, "is mercy that outlived anger." There was no attempt to rewrite history, only to rename it. The red paint of her war markings had thinned to pale streaks along her jaw, and the beaded necklace at her throat shifted in the wind. Her father's hand settled briefly on her shoulder, and she stood a little taller under its weight. Ada was already working. At the kitchen table she spread out the signed quitclaim, the badge Rudd had surrendered, and the witness statements. Martha brought a coil of twine and a strip of wax paper to bind the packet. "Courier leaves at sunup," Ada said.
"By next week, the county will have this on record." She tapped the documents, then slid them into the burlap pouch that smelled faintly of coffee. "I'll wire you when the article's in print." News from town came in by way of Don Mateo's nephew that afternoon. The district office had opened a review of Pike's mining licenses. Under the glare of Ada's coverage and the witness affidavits, Pike had shifted his operations eastward. No one called it surrender, but everyone in Silver Butte understood the meaning. The saloon talk was already fading toward other matters, though Pike's name still carried a taste of iron. As for the unpaid land tax that had been hanging like a trap, Dust walked into the yard carrying a folded receipt from the county. The disputed months had been deferred. The rest could be paid in installments. Mateo had bought a pile of salvaged boards from Dust, enough cash to cover the first payment. The balance would come through labor, fence work, and odd carpentry. The new ledger page was pinned up in Ada's office, in plain view for any to see. Justice, Dust thought, wasn't always in a courtroom. It could be a public record nailed to the wall. That evening, as the shadows cooled the yard, Taya set a folded square of charred paper on the table. It was a map, drawn in ash and charcoal. "Canyon of the Outcasts," she said. "They have their own spring." The lines were rough but sure. A narrow gorge, garden plots, and a cluster of shelters. They're building something worth seeing. Her thumb left a smudge along the edge, and in the corner, Dust had written "water" in his uneven hand, the letters leaning into one another like weary riders. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll see the place hope found to live." The canyon was exactly as Taya had described, narrow enough for shadow to linger even at noon, the walls rising in red-brown cliffs that caught the wind and sang low through the stone. They stayed a full day, walking the gardens where beans climbed pole lattices, where children ran to fetch water in tin pails from the spring. No one asked where Dust or Taya had come from. No one asked what they had left behind. It was the kind of place where a person's present labor mattered more than their past sins. When they left at dawn the next morning, the canyon still slept.
A few lanterns burned low in the huts, and the sound of the spring echoed softly, as if to send them off with its blessing. By mid-afternoon they were back in Silver Butte. The cottonwoods stood just as they had before, steady, patient, watching the water slip through their roots. Dust unpacked Mateo's tools from the mule, while Taya walked the perimeter fence, checking the wire. Life settled quickly into the kind of rhythm that made days slip by unnoticed. Mornings began with raking the yard and feeding the mare that had once been Dust's ticket to land. Afternoons were for fence work, shoring up the barn roof with the salvaged boards Pike's fire had spared. Evenings belonged to the sound of a guitar, sometimes Dust's halting strum, sometimes Taya's clear voice carrying a song in the old language. Inside the cabin, the old, water-warped Bible sat on the table. The pages still clung together in places, but Dust had begun reading a verse or two each night, sounding out the words with the slow care of a man fixing something precious. Mercy, the hound, often lay on the porch as he read, her tail thumping softly in the quiet.
One night, after the work was done and the sky was turning violet, Dust and Taya sat on the porch. The air smelled faintly of mesquite smoke, and the spring's murmur carried up from the cottonwoods. Above them, the stars opened one by one, patient as old friends taking their seats. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. The choice to stay was written in every fence post they'd set together. In every morning they rose to guard the same water. Some promises, Dust thought, are made with hands and silence, not words. The night stretched on, and the world seemed to shrink down to the sound of running water, the weight of the stars, and the faint warmth from the person sitting beside him. Somewhere far east, Pike might have been plotting. The law might have been turning its slow wheels. But here, under this sky, the land was theirs to tend. May this tale stir memories of kindness kept and courage quietly shown, as in your own life's frontier. If it touched your heart, ride with us for more true Wild West stories, where dust, faith, and human spirit still meet under the wide, remembering sky.